Hello, everyone. This is Live Life Well TV host Robert Landau. We are back with another episode of a show that we call Did You Know? This episode we dedicate to, well, what I feel is a true masterpiece of a film, a brilliant story telling vehicle, and one that is sure to touch your heart. Many have seen it, but if you haven't, we so encourage you to do so. It is the iconic blockbuster E.T. Stay tuned. So we would like to acknowledge a wonderful website by the name of mentalfloss.com. Have you seen E.T.? I saw it when it first debuted, and I was living in New York City, and I had to wait in line, which, by the way, lines wrapped around the block. I don't think those were the days when you could buy tickets. But I waited in line for a specific showing when I thought the line wouldn't be too long because it was kind of in the middle of the day on a weekday. But wow, let me tell you something. It was worth every minute that I waited. The theater, typical New York movie theater, it was huge. It was the size of a Broadway theater, huge screen with surround sound. And it just transported me right into the amazing story. But not many people know about some of the background data concerning this major motion picture. So let's get into that for just a little bit. In 1975, an up-and-coming filmmaker, an amazing genius of a filmmaker by the name of Steven Spielberg, totally scared people crazy with his movie Jaws. Do you remember that? People still talk about that movie. And just 2 years later, his masterpiece of a film, another one of my all-time absolute favorites, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, proved that he could and did literally dominate the box office much through the 1980s. One other film that added to that fact was Raiders of the Lost Ark in 1981, and E.T. the Extraterrestrial, which arrived in theaters on June 11th, 1982. Understandably, with the profits of E.T., Columbia Pictures wanted to do a sequel so they could sort of ride on the wave, surf on the wave, so to speak. But Steven Spielberg didn't think it was a good idea, so he said no, though he had a small idea about what would have happened if an alien didn't go back to the mothership at the end of that movie. To ensure they didn't make a sequel without him, Spielberg instead commissioned a writer-director by the name of John Sayles to create a script for a pseudo-sequel by the name of Night Skies. That script was about a suburban family that was absolutely terrorized by a group of aliens, with one of them befriending that family's son. The project was really too dark. It was too dark in tone for Spielberg, though, and ultimately he had Columbia just re-release, this was genius, a special edition of Close Encounters that featured additional scenes. That's the DVD of that amazing movie that I have in my collection. But Steven still recognized the potential of a film like Night Skies, so he and a screenwriter by the name of Melissa Matheson started to create a script for E.T. Melissa Matheson's very first draft of E.T. actually ended up becoming the shooting script. That never happens. Most films go through at least several drafts before a final shooting script is kind of locked into place. But Matheson's first draft happens to be what Spielberg used during shooting. Instead of constantly revising individual drafts, which usually happens, Spielberg gave Matheson the general narrative plot for her to round out. She would write for 5 straight days and then would always collaborate with Steven for 5 successive days filled with feedback. So that was a wonderful pattern dance of working together that they had. This process went on for no less than 8 weeks, and Spielberg later called the resulting screenplay the best draft he has ever read. Now, when you're Steven Spielberg and you say that, that's really something. Remember Drew Barrymore in the film? Drew Barrymore's absolutely wild imagination impressed Steven Spielberg enough that he ended up casting her in the role of Gertie. Getting the right young actors to play the 3 main young siblings in the film was, as you can probably imagine, a huge issue for Spielberg. The first kid he cast was Drew Barrymore as Gertie, the youngest of the 3 kids in the film. During her audition, she was 6 then, Barrymore allegedly told Spielberg that she wasn't really an actress at all, but rather, get this, the drummer of a loud and menacing punk rock band called the Purple People Eaters, who painted their faces with makeup for every show and who had played to an arena packed with thousands of people the night before. At 6 years of age, she just happened to say this during her audition for E.T. Well, Spielberg very intelligently recognized the value of her very vivid imagination. And of course, as we know now, she got the part, and she was brilliant in that part. Remember the other kid? Henry Thomas's improvised audition for E.T. won him the part of Elliot. In 1975, an up-and-coming filmmaker by the name of Spielberg invented what would soon become as, well, a popular summer blockbuster with Jaws, right? 2 years later, he raised his profile yet again with Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and then, of course, E.T. came along. But Henry Thomas, who was a recommendation to Steven for the part of Elliot, was brilliant. And there was nothing for Henry Thomas to read. It was more Spielberg setting up a situation where I think the scenario went where Henry loved somebody so much, maybe a parental figure or a teacher who was going to leave after many years and go back home. And Spielberg said, okay, show us how you would react to that. And Henry Thomas, you can see it on YouTube actually, gave the most brilliant on-the-spot, improvised reaction where he was crying, and it really touches one's heart. And of course, Spielberg couldn't help but give him the role of Elliot. Did you know that a mime was responsible for E.T. the character's hand movements? A puppet can only do so much, so to breathe a little bit more balletic life into his creature, E.T., Spielberg hired professional mime Caprice Roth to provide fluid and naturalistic hand motions. Each time the puppet, E.T., was meant to interact with Elliot or pick certain things up during a scene, Roth would have to lay horizontally beneath the puppet, the character of E.T., and extend her hands vertically for take after take after take. She wore sleeve-length gloves that were made up to look like E.T.'s leathery skin and mimicked his long, slender, four-fingered hands with her ring and pinky fingers sneakily tucked away in the fourth digit. In the final cut, she was credited as E.T. movement coordinator, but her finger movements were absolutely brilliant. Did you know that the first voice of E.T. was Spielberg himself? During shooting, Stephen acted out the voice parts of E.T. by positioning himself just to the right side of the camera, uttering famous phrases like E.T. phone home, but also occasionally speaking in full sentences to better connect the character to the child actors. In the film's rough cut, Spielberg's temp track was later replaced with the voice of actress Deborah Winger. I would have loved to have heard that. For the final print, though, sound designer Ben Burt, who previously worked on all of the Star Wars films and also on Raiders of the Lost Ark with Stephen, hired a non-actor by the name of Pat Welch, whose deep and raspy smoker's voice he overheard at a local camera store. Burt lowered the pitch of her voice and mixed it with sounds of various animals breathing. For her performance, Welch allegedly received only $380. In all, there were 18 different contributors to the final voice of E.T. Well, actually, even those along the way to the final voice. Interesting, huh? And here's another one. Did you know that everything in the famous shot of Elliot and E.T. flying across the face of the moon, do you remember that iconic shot? Everything in that shot was real, except, of course, Elliot and E.T. Visual effects supervisor Dennis Murren and his team at Industrial Light and Magic were tasked with creating organic special effects to surround the potentially inorganic looking E.T. puppet, right? So all of that around him or it was to make it look more real. Surprisingly, the iconic shoot of the boy and alien flying across the full moon was mostly a real shot. It took Murren and his team weeks to find the right spot to film a low moon among trees, so they used maps and charts to coordinate the scene once they found the right spot. In the shot, Elliot and E.T. are puppets that were added with special effects and post-production, but the rest of that shot, the rest of that photo is real. Did you know that the film wowed audiences? Yeah, we do know that, but it also ended up wowing heads of state. The film was released in the US, as we said before, on June 11th, 1982, and would go on, get this, to overtake Star Wars as the highest grossing film of all time, a record it would hold until 1993, when it was beaten by yet another Spielberg film by the name of Jurassic Park. Spielberg would screen the film E.T. at the White House for then President Ronald Reagan and the First Lady, Nancy Reagan. The director recalled sitting next to the president for the show and even thought he saw Reagan shed a tear or two. When the film was screened on the other side of the pond for newlyweds Prince Charles and Princess Diana, Spielberg and the stars in attendance were bizarrely ushered backstage the moment the film was ended without knowing this previously. Apparently, Diana had wept so much when she was watching E.T. that her prim and proper makeup was running, causing the royal minders to decide to whisk her away to redo the makeup before holding an informal meeting at the princess's request. How cool is that? And finally, did you know that Spielberg and co-writer Melissa Matheson envisioned a sequel to E.T. that was eventually abandoned? Here's what the deal is with that. Both Spielberg and Matheson wrote a story treatment for a potential sequel to E.T. during its initial theatrical run. Dated July 17th, 1982, the treatment is titled, for the Part 2, E.T. 2, Nocturnal Fears, and takes place the summer after the events in the first film. The story describes a plot in which Elliot and his friends are abducted by a mutated race of ETs led by an evil entity by the name of Corel, who is looking for Zrek, another alien stranded on Earth. Eventually, E.T. managed to save the group of kids and helps them back to Earth. That would have been the sequel. Ultimately, though, Spielberg decided not to do a sequel because doing so, in his words, would do nothing but rob the original of its virginity. I totally agree. Sounds like an interesting story for part 2, but it does kind of take away from the original E.T., don't you think? Anyway, hope you learned a couple of new things about this cinematic masterpiece. We're so glad you were with us along this way. Thanks for tuning in. This has been Robert Landau, Live Life Well TV host.